All right, take it away.
The ECB is motivated by pride and it's motivated by greed, and websites can maximise those things. 3 points in setup and then 2 arguments. First thing we'll note in setup is that Australians only come to England to play in the county championship fairly infrequently and almost exclusively during years leading up to the Ashes. That's for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's for the reason that Australians have plenty of opportunities to play cricket at home, where they benefit from the comfort of home, where they benefit from all the familiarity and ability to enjoy a kind of local crowd. And then secondly, for the reason that directly clashing with county cricket are leagues like the IPL, and in the future, emergent leagues like Major League Cricket, which offer much more compensation than leagues like county cricket. Secondly, we'll point out that even when Australians are included in the pool of international players, Australians tend to make up a minority of all the players involved in county cricket. We point out, for instance, players like Pujara, who have a diasporic pool much more substantial in England than Australians do. Those players tend to be more popular. Pujara forewent playing in the IPL, for instance, his domestic league to play in county cricket. Generally, there tends to be more players from other countries other than Australia, beyond the intuition push for the reasons that we've described. Thirdly, we point out that we support the policy as written, so we would continue to allow other international players to participate in county cricket. This is limited to Australians. 2 arguments in the speech. The first will explain why allowing Australians to play in county cricket is bad for the ECB's interests in the Ashes. The second argument will explain why this is bad for the development of English talent. Let's start with explaining why this is bad for the ECB's interest in the Ashes. The first thing to note is allowing Australians to play in county cricket gives them a substantial advantage when they play in the Ashes, because it gives them a substantial amount of experience playing in English conditions. That is firstly knowledge of the things which make English cricket unique, the ball's tendency to swing, the prevalence of overcast conditions, a range of things which are present in England and historically have given England an edge at playing at home. But secondly, we point out that beyond the fact that the mechanics of the game are slightly different in England with different pitches, different balls, so on and so forth, that also has a substantial impact on things like the rhythm of the game and the environment that players are playing in, expanding the influence of those factors. So for instance, if the run rate is low because it is hard to build a defense, it's hard to build a partnership, the ball is turning around corners and there's a procession of players into the middle, that is a substantially different experience to flatter or bouncier or whatever other conditions you might experience around the world. So not only is it harder to play the game, it's harder to fall into a rhythm, it's hard to feel comfortable as a player when playing in conditions which are foreign to you, and Australians gain familiarity in those conditions. That's what we explain. But thirdly, it also gives Australians experience against English players. Even if they're not playing exclusively against other Ashes players, they are playing against players who've been brought up in the same systems, who use the same tactics, who use the same techniques, and that is a substantial advantage weighing in favour of Australia. But beyond all this analysis, we'd also point out the number of Australians who give up playing in the IPL to play in county cricket, which is evidence prima facie of how valuable they see this opportunity as being. Stars who could get huge contracts in the IPL, so players like Steve Smith, players like Marnus Labuschagne, who choose to county cricket over the IPL, over the hundreds of thousands of dollars, for the very reason that they understand this will give them a substantial advantage in the Ashes. Second part of this argument, this is harmful for England's chances in the Ashes for 2 reasons. The first thing we note is that this is unreciprocated and every other Ashes is played in Australia, and English players who only really get the chance to play in Australia in much more limited circumstances, i.e. limited overs competitions like Big Bash, do not benefit in the same way, which is part of what has led to such a kind of slanted record over time of Australia almost always winning in Australia, but also bringing the competition to English shores and not allowing England to be so dominant on their own turf. But secondly, we point out that this forgoes an otherwise very substantial benefit. That is, not only has all the analysis I've provided to you so far explain why conditions are important, but also those conditions are very unique to England. That is, it is difficult for Australians to gain experience in other ways. Unlike, for instance, Australian conditions, bounce, which are fairly similar to South African conditions, or Indian conditions, spin, which are fairly similar to Pakistani conditions, or Sri Lankan conditions, it is very difficult to replicate the conditions in England. It's unlikely Australians get the same advantage we've explained in any other way. Why is this the most important thing in the debate? There are a number of reasons why. The first thing we note is the margin of victory is important. So this team might be smacking their lips thinking, Australia hasn't won in England for a while, but that's not relevant. What's relevant is your ability to win by a substantial amount. Cricket isn't just a game determined by who wins at the end, but what happens, the particular battles which unfold. People remember the highlights, not the results, which is why taking away the opportunity for England to have more, like 5-wicket hauls, giving the opportunity for Australians to mount centuries and mount, partnerships is a harm in and of itself, even if England is still able to win in other ways, right? Because it's those highlights, it's the kind of, the status of the game more so than the result of the game, which people remember. But secondly, we point out that Australia is kind of rapidly improving in English conditions. For instance, they were able to retain the Urn in 2019 and probably should have won if not for a series of very dramatic chokes. And chokes should probably be more common, we would know, if they didn't play in England all the time. Thirdly, we point out that England gets walloped in Australia, like they get 5-0 fuck off or 4.9-0 fuck off last time they were here. And we point out that's important because it means that where there's an imbalance in the Ashes, English fans feel like they're losing. Even if the urn gets passed back and forth, which is the best case scenario for this team, it feels like they're losing because in Australia, Australians are so dominant. And finally, we point out that England is defending a very proud streak of not allowing Australia to win the Ashes in England since 2001. So the very evidence this team might provide to you to say, oh, well, England's doing okay, is also the very reason why continuing that performance, hamstringing Australian improvement, and continuing dominance is the most relevant thing in this debate. We'd point out the ECB is motivated by pride and it's motivated by greed. And the factors in this speech have explained to you two things. The first is that the ECB is likely to have a personal motivation to stop Australia from having all this advantage that we've explained. And maintain their kind of streak of dominance in England. But also that from a commercial point of view, it's much easier to get the average English punter who's not a cricket tragic, not a huge cricket fan, to pay attention when the home side is winning, when they can go to the ground and it's electric rather than dampened, when they can tune in and see positive coverage rather than negative coverage. This is good for the ECB's commercial interests. I'm going to briefly preempt the claim that this makes the Ashes more competitive. 3 pushes there. The first, we will note it kind of is going to be competitive either way. It's a pretty massive mountain these guys would need to climb to explain in the absence of county cricket, the Ashes wouldn't be competitive enough to be popular, pretty ridiculous. Secondly, we point out that a close match is only good for viewership when you are winning. That is the reason close matches often garner a lot of viewership, is because of the catharsis, release, celebration, revelry that follows it. If you're consistently losing closely, that's unlikely to generate you much of a benefit. And finally, we point out that most Australian viewership, which is what might be benefited by Australia going well, is mostly just cricket tragics who are tuning in at 8, 9, 10, 11 p.m. to watch, when they could be going out instead or something like that. People who are likely to watch either way. We claim the bandwagoners, the people in England who just want to see their side win. The ECB is motivated by pride and greed. We protect that. Second argument in this speech is about development. This is pretty simple. By importing Australian players in, key English players miss out on the opportunity to firstly, specifically play important roles, which is often what Australians come in to fill as star players or Ashes hopefuls. So for instance, they miss out specifically on opening the batting, or being the kind of go-to bowler, as opposed to, we can see they still are able to play, but they miss out on these key roles. But secondly, we'd point out they also miss out playing in a high-pressure environment. If Steve Smith has scored 120 before you in the county championship, substantially easier to bat after him. The bowlers are tired. You don't feel the need to get off the mark very quickly. Things are much easier. Those development opportunities, while we can see less important, are valuable for England's hopes in the Ashes long-term. And for these 2 reasons, we're proud to support them.
Firstly, on the interest of the ECB. Notably, this is probably the best and most important contention here because we think it is probably on financial profit because necessarily it is the precondition in order to allow for the ECB to access all of the things that they're talking about on their side. Secondly, they probably care much more for success, both in the current short-term fostering of success in terms of winning the Ashes, but also in long-term success for two notable reasons. Firstly, because there's a huge cultural and historical importance placed upon English cricket because it's seen as the house of the Lords, and also because it is central to their national identity, central to their game, which means that it is historically inconsistent insofar as, given that the English Cricket League and the strength of England as a cricket country has declined given the success of Australia-India, it means that there has been decade-long lulls, often in the period of English history, where they have been unsuccessful, and this is something that is a sore spot, specifically for the ECB, because you can look at the past 8 years or whatever, where they have been unsuccessful internationally. Secondly, we would say that they have been historically dominant in the past, before the success of Australia Australia and India, for example, and this is something that they still cling on to and quite highly weigh. Notably, this is all just context which explains to you why it is particularly important that you ought care most substantially about specifically the success of, or like the structural robustness of the county leagues in England. Two arguments then in the speech. Firstly, on why this benefits the quality of the county leagues. Secondly, on revenue. The first thing I would point out is just to explain that given that there is an international dynasty and dominance that exists in most sports anyways, we will note that this is often, if not always, predicated upon domestic and competitive development insofar as in order to succeed internationally, this requires a strong domestic league. If you have a bad domestic league, there is no infrastructure which facilitates international success. This is particularly important because if you have a weak county league, the ECB is unlikely to succeed internationally, unlikely to push its reaches into other leagues, unlikely to access greater audiences, things like that. 3 points of notable context here. Firstly, in terms of contracts, direct response here. Firstly, we would explain to you that the contracts that the Australians opt into when they play in the county leagues are notably short-term, but often transition into long-term contracts after they retire internationally because of the fact that there is substantial money and lucrative contracts which exist in these county leagues. Why is this the case? Firstly, because the county leagues are substantially just far larger. There are something like 20 clubs which exist in the county domestic league in both the first and second division, ignorant of like subsidiary divisions. Notably in Australia, in the counterfactual, which they try to say is the counterfactual that these Australian alternatives have anyways. It's literally 6 teams, so numerically you have a much smaller ability to play, but also you just have less audience, which English people are more than Australians. Secondly, in terms of direct response, they talk about the IPL. I think the thing they forget is that the IPL occurs before the Ashes and all of those things, which means 2 things. Firstly, it's a different fucking format, so not all of the crossovers they talk about in terms of the conditions and stuff like that, and how it's really important that you can't play fastball in English conditions versus Australian conditions, don't transfer over at the point at which the IPL is a completely different format, so all of those things are symmetric. But we would note the Australian players who miss out on IPL contracts are notably the people who opt into these county leagues and play in these county leagues. But secondly, they also have specific incentives, i.e. Australian players in county leagues in England, to win the Ashes, which is why they play in the county leagues in the first place. Secondly, thirdly, in terms of context, is about the conditions. All of this is largely the same. Essentially, English conditions are significantly different to Australian conditions. That's why they're playing. That's why there's a massive difference when Australia plays on home soil versus outside or in English soil. Cool. 4 mechanisms for why it is that this English league, this county league, is substantially improved when you have Australian talent playing. Firstly, in terms of resources and players. Because of the nature of how it's implemented empirically, when you have 2 foreign players per team, this notably mitigates all this stuff about crowding out and stuff like that. And also the context about having 20 domestic leagues in the county league also mitigates all of their stuff down to basically nothing. But it means that there's likely dissemination of talent and a whole bunch of things, which notably means that these talents on net, these teams as well, are able to develop. Why are they able to develop? Because the prima facie push I'm going to give here is when you have good players join a bad team, the good player pulls the bad team up. But on top of that, they bring along with them a set of expertise, a set of experience, a set of networking aspects, and along with all of that, a set of cross-pollination mechanisms which allow for these talent groups to get better and stuff like that. When you talk about different tactics that you might use in the national league, and you bring that across to the county league as an Australian, that is likely to increase the experience and increase the skill level of these county players. But notably, because there's only a limit of 2 per county league, that means the Australian players are spread out quite widely, which means that you get a whole array of different teams, whether they're high profile, big, strong, county leagues like Sussex and Surrey and stuff like that, but also less, I guess expensive and less well-funded teams with less success. They probably have some Australian talent from the national team playing in the county league, which means that a whole range of teams get better access to this. This is particularly important because there is very rare English success overseas, which at the point at which you're able to improve the domestic league, you're likely able to improve English success globally, which is probably something that the ACB cares quite a lot about. Secondly, in terms of viewership, if you have Steve Smith playing and with a 100-run win, that's probably something quite quite entertaining, something that you care a lot about, something that drives people to watch these teams in the counterfactual. Because if you're in a middling second division or bottom of the table first division and an international player comes, that's another reason to go and watch the game and watch. That means you get more viewership, that means these teams get more funding and all that stuff. But also notably, secondly, it means that you just get like better things that come out in terms of legitimization. This is the third mechanism, which is essentially at the point at which you're able to garner just interest in terms of soft power, you're more likely to get domestic interest in terms of the country, which means you get more talent, more players are like willing and likely to become cricket players because they're like, oh, we get to cross-pollinate. Even if I don't make the national team, I can still play with English or like Australian players. That's something I want to do. Maybe they're your idol. But also in terms of the long term, it means that short-form cricket, which is traditionally what has become more popular globally, is likely the thing that the ECB is pushing against, because notably the Ashes format and the ECB format is very different to short-term cricket. So at the point at which county cricket and the format in county cricket is becoming more popular, then that obviously increases the leverage that ECB has against short-form cricket that's becoming more popular. Fourthly and finally, why this is uniquely Australian and not like other international players, we will explain to you that there is just no sports rivalry that is anywhere close to the amount of distrust, or I guess like sports dislike that there exists between the English and the Australians. But also because the Australian series is historically viewed as the main thing that the English care about. Because all the English victories, if you look at all of their trophy cases and all of that, are Ashes wins that have occurred over Australians. Thirdly and finally, we'll just explain to you that this is probably the best and highest quality. Insofar, Australians probably just have the greatest amount of talent pool, i.e. 3 out of the best 15 bowlers and 4 out of the top 10 batsmen are Australian, which means when those players play in these county leagues, you get more of that cross-pollination effect I was talking about. That just means you get a better league, which is probably quite important. Let's talk about revenue quickly. 3 points of context. Firstly, since the 2005 Ashes paywall that was instigated, Ashes and just paywall cricket that has existed in English in England has declined steadily in terms of viewership and revenue because of the paywall. Secondly, there has just been an English drought for the past 8 years in terms of getting shit done because they're just getting absolutely slammed internationally. And thirdly, there's a lack of reciprocal investment because at the point at which you're successful, at the point at which you have good domestic leagues, at the point at which you have more revenue, this allows for all the interest that you have secondary to that. Why do you get more revenue? More viewership means more revenue. At the point at which you have international talent, especially Australian international talent, which is a strong rivalry, join and play in even a second or first division club. That means you get more people to your seats, that means you get more people watching. But specifically in terms of the Ashes context, that means you get a longer burn-in period in terms of you get more people talking about this for a longer time, you get more media narratives, you get more hype around the Ashes, which means more people go and watch the Ashes, which means on that metric alone you get more revenue. So Carton again.
Does side negative improve county cricket? They say this allows people in county cricket a tool of development and it's going to help the UK win the Ashes even more strongly. There are a number of problems with this argument. The first thing to note is that this is entirely unimportant because if you want to pick out the best players who are going to do well extremely in prestigious international tournaments like the Ashes, you just need way fewer people than they attempt to develop through their tool of making county cricket better. You can just pick out the star players and put them on the team that plays in the Ashes. It's incredibly unclear why your whole domestic league needs to be substantially better. But secondly, the tool they provide is a very bad one. I would note that literally only 4 counties in the UK county cricket scene are even competitive in the first place. And that means even if they're putting in some good Australian players, it's incredibly unclear that those Australian players can transform the league and make the conditions such that UK players through across many counties who probably don't get to play with the few Australian players who get in there, who provide a massive benefit to those Australian players' teams in the Ashes when they go back, but provide very diffuse benefit to the whole of county cricket in the UK, it's incredibly unclear that that gets them that benefit, even if those players are good and useful. But thirdly, those players are not good and useful, and that is for 4 reasons. The first is because it's hard to develop often, even harder when you're playing with one really excellent player, because you yourself often are just doing less work. You're doing less work to become a player to improve your technique. And secondly, that's particularly true when you have players that do targeted development. The Australian stars like Steve Smith who come in take the important roles that would otherwise go to English cricket players who could develop their skills. But I note thirdly that the Australians they're talking about have no incentive to help. They don't want to drastically transform the league. And I would note empirically that they often play like 5 or 6 games to get the benefits that we describe in detail at Daniel of understanding what the turf is like, of getting a sense of what it's like to play in the UK, but they have absolutely no reason, in fact they have every reason not to transform English cricket or provide a benefit to underprivileged players in their leagues who could later on form part of the international team that could displace their power in in their home country. Absolutely perverse as to why they would do that. But finally, I know there's also a pretty limited benefit to playing with good players if you're not going to continue playing with them later. Like, sport is often about adjusting to your team dynamic, working with the people who are going to be in your team for a while. It's unclear that you get massive development from playing in the vicinity of a good player for 5 teams, or 5 games rather, where that player has no incentive to make you good. Incredibly unclear that the facts they point to, which is these Australian players who go over are very good, have the capacity to reach any of the benefits they are describing. But the final thing I've noticed is that their benefits, even if they get them, are totally inexclusive, right? Like, there are still some good players in county cricket in England who can develop people, and importantly, those people might not be as good as Steve Smith in all cases, but they are good enough to develop the mid-tier players. Like, that threshold is passed, such that we're able to get requisite development to improve those leagues anyway. You do not get that from a few Australian expats going over for a couple of games at a time. The second claim they make then is that this might get the ECB money because you draw in new audiences for county cricket. There are, again, I think 5 problems with this argument. The first thing I'd note is that county cricket is extremely poorly broadcast. It clashes with other games like the IPL. It is hard to watch at the same time. That is just true. It's also just really hard to watch outside of England, and people very rarely want to. I would note that they just cannot attract new audiences because cricket viewership in the West is often international, but viewership for county cricket is about local pride, right? Like, you go for your local county, you're not watching it as some person in Australia, and that means that having more Australian players doesn't attract anyone new because the audiences are basically set because it is such a parochial system with parochial viewership. But secondly, I note that even if you make it slightly more exciting to watch county cricket, you don't make it exciting enough to change the incentives people have of, for instance, not watching the IPL, which is to say that you could watch those players like Steve Smith elsewhere in other games. It's not clear that you can only watch them through county cricket, and also they're just drowned out by other players. You might have one excellent player, that's not enough to make the game good, which is exactly what attracts people to that in the first place. But I note thirdly that it's just an unimportant argument because county cricket A makes the ECB no money for the reasons I did before, that it's really hard to broadcast outside of the UK, but secondly, that they just have ways of making money in many, many other ways. For instance, limited overs cricket, like the T20, like one-day matches, like the 100, which are way more lucrative and are things that the ECB is in fact turning to, that are far, far, far more trustworthy profit generators than any of the mechanisms provided by this opposition bench. And that's why it's incredibly unclear that these guys get the ECB any money, that they get them that money in the long term at all, and we would rather that they invested their resources in other things like increasing funding to things like T20 or one-day matches if those are such financially beneficial things to do. So, the next thing I'm going to talk about is where this debate really sits, which is about winning the Ashes. We explained that winning the Ashes consistently and by a very large margin is the ECB's primary interest, and side negative absolutely surrenders it. We explained that this is the world's oldest cricket rivalry for like 2 centuries or whatever, that the prestige and the viewership it attracts is equivalent to the World Cup, and this dwarfs even their best and most optimistic predictions for how much more profitable they're going to make county cricket. We think winning the Ashes in a year where you might have otherwise lost, or winning it by a larger margin, where you might have won it by a smaller margin, gets you literally millions of dollars more, vastly more prestige as well, which is what the ECB cares about, in addition to just money, than any kind of improvements to county cricket, which get you. And importantly, it's as well a career maker for players who obviously are in the ECB's interest to care about. We explain losing is devastating not only because of that prestige, but also because of expectations. Because the UK does have a streak of domestic wins since 2001, and it is not tense to say that the UK has expectations of victory to uphold, but also is having those expectations encroached upon by Australia's increasing success since 2009. And I note the first negative concedes basically all of this characterization, which is to say that yes, the Ashes is very important, it's very, very important we win by a large margin, and failure in fact is possible, which they do not contend with, because winning by a small margin on your home turf is in fact losing to the ECB, because you need to counterbalance the walloping that the English get in Australia anyway. You importantly lose the prestige of clear wins, and we know that Australians are improving, and the county cricket offers Australians an extremely large advantage in terms of getting to know the turf. And they want to say that this is marginal or this is symmetric in the debate, but it absolutely is not, because even if you only have 1 or 2 players going over to the UK, that can make a difference given the small amount of players who are are playing in the Ashes, those 1 or 2 players are hugely important. And we would note that Australians often give up huge pay packets of playing, for instance, in the IPL in order to go over. And that indicates that their revealed preference is very strongly to get this advantage, and that they see that as more financially and professionally important to them than, for instance, getting millions of extra dollars in another competition. Simply having that home turf advantage, the evidence already exists to you as to why that is so important to Australian players. They say there are very few Aussies going over, so you don't actually crowd people out. But that importantly just doesn't understand how the game works, right? Which is like, even if you only have a few people going over, that doesn't get them their benefit of massively transforming county cricket leagues, where you have thousands of mid-tier players whose playing you need to transform. But that does get us our benefit, or our harm rather, of transforming the Ashes, which is a very small group of very elite players whose playing you can disrupt when you send an Australian over. And importantly as well, secondly, you're crowding out other English players from important positions, even if there are only very few Australian players going, and that is why absolutely this allows you to win the Ashes, and absolutely, as we explained as well, this means that you get far better development of English cricket leagues when you don't have their best players drowned out by people like Steve Smith.
This opposition team teaches their case in claiming that all the ECB cares about is winning the Ashes and winning them now. But the problem is, aside from pride, they never explain why this is so deeply important. This is in the context when, since 2005, national cricket in England has been behind a paywall, we've seen continually declining viewership. The fact that until 2019, every Ashes series was a wipeout by England, in England that is, which continually saw dropping viewership because games that were not competitive and where the result was assumed was not something that would actually incentivize people to actually go out and watch in the first place. That was the context and reality of this debate. And the fact that they never explain why just Australian players being in county means they will succeed all of the time, and never explains why this makes it impossible for the English team to win, shows that they will lose. And the fact that the Ashes wasn't the only thing that was important in this debate, that it wasn't the only thing the ECB cared about, is exactly why we take this debate. I'm going to do 3 questions in the speech. I'm going to start by looking at whether the current success of the English cricket team is bettered under either side. I will note here, they do not explain why the ECB only cares about the current or short-term Ashes, because obviously, as we identified, continuing to succeed and be competitive and win in future Ashes series is also incredibly important. And that is something England has historically struggled with, at the point when they have suffered from generational gaps more than most, because of the fact that, as they explained, domestic structure of county cricket only has a couple of clubs that are particularly successful and not entirely successful in the long run. They have 3 reasons to suggest why this is worse for England's chances to win the Ashes under our side. The first is that Australian players get knowledge of conditions, and the second is that they experience English players. I'm going to respond to both of these simultaneously. First thing to explain is they never explain why it is that just because you play county cricket as an Australian, you're going to score 700 runs in the Ashes and take a bajillion wickets. Players like Cameron Bancroft went and played and succeeded in county cricket, and they were absolutely fucking owned in the Ashes. Because it turns out, playing in a competition like county cricket that isn't necessarily the highest quality competition does not guarantee that you'll succeed on the national level. And note how that immediately wipes out a huge amount of their harms, because so much of their analysis is conditional on players going to county and that being the sole reason they succeed and do well and win. Notably, Steve Smith's literally series-winning performance last Ashes series in England, he did not play county cricket at all in the lead up to that, and he was playing in the IPL, and yet he was still able to do very, very well. So, the chance of you winning the Ashes is not maximised drastically just because of the fact these English players won't play. The second reason why this is the case is to look at the types of Australian players who actually go off and play in county, which is that, generally speaking, it is often players on the fringes of national selection. It is people like Todd Murphy, who are not probably going to get named for Australia over the Ashes itself, or people like Marcus Harris, who are trying to get their way into the side, players who are hungry and have lots to learn, but are unlikely to give series-defining performances at the point they're in the Ashes, which means that it's simply not that important for their side. Their last claim here in response to this is to be like, oh, well this isn't, final thing to note is obviously this is obviously symmetric as well, to the extent that obviously if Australian players get practice against English players get practice in knowledge against Australian players as well. So that is to say, if you're a Jimmy Anderson bowling to Steve Smith in county cricket, you have more chance to analyse his technique in those conditions and identify how it is you might be able to be more successful in the national series when you actually want to win. You just get more data points, which obviously maximises your chances there. final thing they claim is like, oh, well, this isn't reciprocated by Australia. But obviously, at the point in which you were able to maximise the chance of Cricket Australia allowing English players to play in Australia, something which has become increasingly more likely and has been discussed in recent times by Cricket Australia because of the fact that Ashes series have been bad for viewership in Australia because they've been so uncompetitive, you are never going to get that benefit at the point in which you ban Australian players from playing in county. If you allow them to continue playing in county cricket, you at least have the possibility that English players will never play in Australia at some point in the future. That is an enormous benefit. Quick point is substantive then on why this is just better for us. Notably, the Ashes is not the only test series that matters to the ECB. The World Test Championship has just started. It is in its third cycle. England have not won yet. They have the chance to be the second country ever to win all three of these championships. It is something that they deeply care about. This current English team has identified they care about. We're going to explain why you maximise their success currently, both in the Ashes and also more broadly. Why in the Ashes? Firstly, as I've already explained, you can simply just scout out the weaknesses of Australian players better and get far more information earlier in the season. Particularly against these players who might be in the national team, but you probably have a smaller sample size of. Like, it's probably very valuable to get information on people like Marcus Harris, who have not played as much in England, who just have less data points. Secondly, it just draws out a high level of performance when games are competitive. That is to say, it forces you to reach for a higher standard, it forces you to not be lazy, it forces you to actually push yourself and put yourself in the exact same kinds of situations that this team said was so valuable for county players on a national level, which is deeply important at the care. WTC value things like getting wins in overseas countries so that you can maximise your chances of making that final. You needed to put yourself in those tough situations to prove you could win. That was great for your culture as a team, it's great for your success as a team. Thirdly, this extra knowledge you get from Australian players from them playing county is also just useful actually when you play Ashes in England as well, because of the fact they obviously speak about their own experiences at home and compare it to England, and you can obviously learn from that knowledge. Knowledge often travels around the cricket circus pretty rapidly. It's very easy for you to get access to this type of knowledge. Broadly, it means that you work harder, etc. This is probably very, very good. Next then, let's talk about domestic cricket, which they try to say is unimportant by being like, oh, we don't care about a very strong domestic development league. I would note, at the point in my first year, I got thrown by Leah and Udai multiple times. It's probably the reason why I am not complete shit now. I would suggest that, like, comparatively, English players in county also maximally benefit from this opportunity. Because note, even the players on the fringes of national selection are still far better than the average player in county because of that division structure and how many teams there are. Quality is often something that's fairly limited. The responses they give to this point, I think, just do not understand how sport works. Their first claim is this takes opportunities away from English players. But notably, this isn't really true, because the type of contacts these Australian players take are often in these lower tier counties when there's not really anyone who's deserving of a place that much anyway. Which is to say then, you have replacing a kind of middling player who isn't super good, and put in, with a bunch of other middling players, this really good player who is able to give a lot of experience and value and culture. That means that you get a lot of knowledge you otherwise would not have access to. Because lots of these English county players don't have other ways to access this knowledge because of the fact they don't get the opportunities to do things like play in the IPL. Lots of the smaller clubs, especially in England, often benefit from this. I would note Midas Labuschagne got his success in a Division 2 county and made that county massively more successful while he was there. Extraordinary large benefit. The second thing is they don't know a widespread strong domestic league for success. One, long term, yes you do. At the point where the majority of counties aren't fantastic, it's terrible that the players who will be the next person to be selected on that national team barely get good practice ever because of the fact that A-Series tours are so rarely played. But notably, because you need to aid that transition and you do not want people to join the national team, immediately fail and then be punted and never play again, like has happened with literally so many English players because of the fact their averages are so low. It's deeply important you actually raise the overall standard of that domestic competition so you have the capacity to do so. Thirdly, they're like, oh, well, you can't rapidly destroy until the league. Obviously not, but it still raises the quality and it increases that over time. And notably, because Australian players are so good, the types of replacement international players you get often aren't that much. Because obviously places like India or Sri Lanka have their own domestic structures. Often there are less players from there that are high profile want to play overseas, which means that when you cut up Australian players, the players they replace with are actually just far, far worse, which means there is an appreciable drop in quality there. Fourthly, they're like, oh, we get worse opportunities to these players within. Notably, this is wrong for a number of reasons. One, these players rarely play a full season. They usually only play half. County goes throughout the Ashes as well and after. So, even if you lose out on some opportunities, you get those later in the season anyway. Finally, they're like, oh, these players have no incentive to help. One, we explain you what later contracts. People like Ricky Ponting often went and played county cricket after their careers. It's deeply valuable at the point in which you can get a relationship with a club that means you can go back, given that county relative to other domestic leagues like the Sheffield Shield is actually much better paying. That is obviously a huge benefit for you individually as a career. The final thing I want to respond to here is that claim is like, oh, well, you're forsaking the IPL. That shows how important it is. The IPL does not fucking run during the majority of the county season. And not only that, the types of players who go are actively players who do not get offered IPL contracts because they're a different format. They're not as good at that format. They don't play it. They don't have that level of success. There's not other cricket for Australians to play at this time. They play this, they're able to vote their skills to counties. They develop relationships with those counties. Midas has played for Look at the name of Middlesex or whatever. Literally every single year since 2019, that has been extremely beneficial for him as a player. He's now one of the best players in the world. He can now share that with the entire county. And it was there he got a technique change that made him good. And it was there where he was able to share that knowledge with other players in a way that was really powerful. Finally, on the moneyship and viewership material, their claim here is like, oh, a competitive series people won't want to watch because it's a loss. Obviously, at the point it's competitive, people feel like they have to watch it because it's exciting, it creates tension, they'll miss something. Obviously, at the point where you maximize that, more people are willing to watch it, that does drive up revenue. So proud of them. Oh, they did.
Think about how far the negative team has to go in this debate for any of their arguments to actually make sense. Because they want you to believe that half a dozen Australian players going to play county cricket once every 4 years will have such an effect in improving county cricket, in both its revenues and its quality, that England will therefore be substantially more competitive at the Ashes, which is the end goal that they conceive is what is important in this debate. Obviously, the far easier way to just get that benefit was to lock out the largest advantage Aussies currently had, which was knowledge of English conditions. So, a couple of things in this speech. Firstly, why this does not improve domestic development, weighing that against the Ashes, and then why we definitely win the Ashes more often and by larger margins as a result. Let's start with the issue of domestic development. There are two contentions here. The first is that this develops a domestic league, which is helpful because a stronger domestic league means that you are better when it comes to the Ashes. But they themselves contest whether this premise is even true when they suggest that it's unclear, for example, that playing county cricket makes you any better at the Ashes. So they must first explain to you why it is that improving the domestic league would have any benefit, considering that obviously very few of the people who play in that league will then go on to play in the Ashes. But we give you a series of reasons as to why, in fact, the domestic league is very likely to suffer as a result of the addition of these Australian players. The thing we point out is that you lock people out of key roles. The importance of this argument is it's asymmetric. So yes, it's true that the benefit that they accrue to development from the league is very infrequent because these players only come over every 4 years and there's only a few of them, but the harm that accrues from that is very large because, for example, having someone be your lead batsman means that someone else on the English side does not develop a specialty in that particular skill for a whole year, which is very substantial as a loss, even if the benefit to the league is very small. But secondly, we say that you're very likely to experience other harms as a result of it. For example, a key part of cricket is being able to deal with pressure, being able to bat when you're behind, etc. When you just have Steve Smith on your team, you never feel that pressure. You're never worried. You know that every game is in the bag, so you never bother to learn how to cope with those kinds of skills. So a key part of the game is lost to you. But thirdly, we explained to you that Steve Smith is obviously not going to go around developing the team, right? Like Dan's analogy of like being probed by me is deeply disanalogous. The reason that I spent a huge amount of time between debates and after debates giving feedback, putting together a development plan, doing a lot of work. I doubt Steve Smith does anything like that. For example, when Junhao paid Sherms to do a comp with her, do you think that Junhao got a lot of benefit out of that? Or do you think that Sherms stood outside smoking darts and then came in and just won the debate at the end of the day? It doesn't actually help you get better. Just because you win doesn't mean you improved in any way at the end of that. Which suggests why, in fact, this on net is very likely to worsen the league. This is important because if you believe that, their only pathway to getting better at the Ashes is immediately out and they lose the debate on their own terms. The second way they try and explain that this might be useful for the ECB is to suggest that this could improve money and viewership of county cricket. The first problem is obviously they explain no imperative as to why the ECB particularly needs money. They explain no incentive as to why the ECB probably weighs the viewership of county cricket particularly highly. We provide a series of reasons down the bench as to why the Ashes intuitively is the most important thing in the debate. So even if you believe they accrue this benefit, it's unclear why it matters at all in the debate. But they do not for 7 reasons. Firstly, they ignore the fact that bringing in Australian talent is extremely expensive. Steve Smith and Marnus Labuschagne don't play for nothing, which means that even if you generate some additional revenue, there's a high burden to explain why that amount of money covers the costs that you have to pay to bring those players in the first place. Secondly, we explained that because these kinds of comps clash with things like the IPL and Super Cricket, it's very unlikely that you're going to go watch this instead of those much more popular formats. Particularly at the point in time where, for example, T20 is far more popular format than Test cricket because there's much lower time commitment, because there's more excitement, etc. People are more likely to go watch those particular formats. The only response to this argument is to repeatedly and factually assert that the IPL does not clash with county cricket. Like, it literally does, and the logic for why it does is very simple. It's just that cricket is a summer format, which means that you tend to play it, at the same time of year if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, which is why a large number of these comps tend to overlap in when they're scheduled. Thirdly, we point out that it's very unlikely you can actually get additional fans because the key driver of county cricket is that of local diehards who really care about their own county and are willing to commit huge amounts of time in order to go watch that particular thing. Having Steve Smith there doesn't actually attract any of these people because he's not a local, he's not from the local area, etc. If you're a Steve Smith fan, you wouldn't go and watch him at the county cricket, you'd wait till he went and played internationally. You'd wait till he played at the Ashes when you'd actually get to see him do something exciting and not wreck a bunch of English scrubs who can't play in the first place, as this team concedes when they say the domestic league is bad. But fourthly, we explained to you that this league is incredibly poorly broadcasted. You can't even watch it if you're not in the UK, or it's very difficult to do so, which suggests it's unlikely to be driving huge amounts of revenue. Additionally, we point out the fact that there's a huge time commitment to watching a test cricket format rather than another format. It means it's very unlikely you accrue very large audiences. And it's much more likely that you would just not... the final thing to say is just that if you cared as ECB about attempting to generate revenue or viewership, there are much easier pathways to do so. When we talk about things like the 100. Even if you believe none of this, all you need to do at the end of this is just weigh the probability of how likely is it that having like 6 Australians every 4 years boosts your viewership or boosts your revenue sufficiently that it outweighs just the benefit we get of England does slightly better at the Ashes, which means, for example, the marginal bandwagoner wants to come and watch the Ashes at the pub because exciting things are happening, versus them needing to prove to you that a bunch of people consistently pay huge amounts of money to go watch county cricket, spend huge amounts of time to go watch county cricket. Notably, the eyeballs on the Ashes are far more valuable because the broadcast rights are more expensive, so you get more money getting one person to watch the Ashes than you do getting 5 or 10 people to go watch county cricket. So even at their best case there, we easily weigh out all of that. But we explained to you that none of this matters, because obviously the most prestigious match, the most prestigious rivalry, and the oldest rivalry represented by the Ashes was just so much more important to the ECB in this debate. And if we could prove to you that we were more likely to perform well at the Ashes, that immediately outweighs everything else in the debate. We give you 4 sets of reasons as to why this is likely that receive insufficient response. The first thing we say is that Australians get knowledge of English conditions when they're able to come to England. And there are 3 reasons that this is important. Firstly, because the nature of the game means that there are different mechanics based on different pitches, which means that knowledge of how those pitches operate is a huge advantage that England would otherwise have that they give away. Secondly, because, for example, it's very difficult to build experience on those pitches because, one, English pitches are very unique, which is why the size of that advantage is very large, but also because very few games are played on those particular pitches in England. County cricket is one of the few ways you get to be able to do so. Secondly, though, we explained to you that you're more likely to gain knowledge of the rhythm of the game, and considering it's often very psychological, you need to understand things like audience energy and pressure. Being able to do so in that context is very useful. Thirdly, we explained to you get experience against English players, which is why, for example, teams like this one spend so long scrimming against various other opponents or Australs concedes that you want to hit all the competition and see what they're all about. But finally, we shortcut all of this by explaining that the revealed preference of actors in the game explains that this must be a huge advantage. Because otherwise, why would Steve Smith or Mark Labuschagne give up the $1 million paychecks they could get in the IPL to go play county cricket, which fucking sucks and is in England, an awful place to be? You could be in God's country, Australia, instead, or, at least making money in the IPL. Clearly, they make this huge sacrifice because they believe that this is a huge benefit to them. It's also the same reason why Australia doesn't allow other people to play in the Sheffield Shield. Like, if it was so good as they say, why wouldn't Australia allow them to do it? Because even Australia, which doesn't have unique pitch conditions, notes the advantage of being able to lock England out and have that home game's advantage. Why did this matter in the debate? Because we unlock a huge tool for England by allowing them to maintain a home game advantage. That means, 1, they're more likely to win, which is crucially important because losing a home game was so humiliating that being able to avoid the risk of that, even if it was marginal, was important. We also explained it just meant winning more clearly. When you get walloped by Australia every time you go to Australia, being able to repeat that or replicate that at home was important and did win us this debate.
First, on the trade-off in the Ashes, note here that we directly challenge the reality of the mechanisms the Affirmative team give you. We tell you that actually playing in these tests is just not a guaranteed way to make you that much better in the Ashes. They tell you that sports people trade off lots of other things to go and do this. Notably, sports people mad superstitious and often just make a lot of poor decisions. They should not be considered as a proof in this debate, right? Then we point to things like Cameron Bancroft, who actually doesn't demonstrate that these are not necessarily directly useful for you, right? Outside of that though, we tell you that actually it's probably just symmetric, right? In the fact that to the extent that Australia can go and play on English conditions, English players can now watch Australian players play in English conditions. The whole, the crux of this point tries to turn on the idea that English conditions are so unique and so important, there's a major advantage for the English team. Normally that means that watching Australian players play in that scenario on those fields is a significant advantage also to the English team, an advantage they cannot get in other ways. I think the third push here is just the counterfactual is that Australia goes and does tours of England. They just go and play other games at other points in time without any contribution to your local clubs. In fact, they only benefit the most elite of players. At that point, I think it's pretty clear that you actually probably just don't get that significant advantage that they are so worried about, right? The negative team tells us, the affirmative tells us that we need to win the Ashes, and that giving this benefit up is a key reason we're unable to win. They're quite broad definition of what winning the Ashes involves, right? I think we know very clearly on the negative team there is a series of other mechanisms that drive the engagement in the Ashes, because they say you need to win because that drives the engagement. There are actually other things that contribute to that, right? There's things like the media run-up. The fact there are Australian players playing in the county leagues means there is discussion and airtime and operation of those ideas and exploration, and the build-up around those things is what drives engagement in the Ashes, right? But also just having a really high-quality game. Notably here, if you do get the absolute stomping that they want, you actually see Test cricket lose a whole day of tickets you can sell, right? Notably, the last is now the most highest ticket selling days because they are the exciting days. People want to go and see the day when their team wins, and when that day is often towards the end of the test is predictable, they are more likely to bite into those days, more likely to attend in higher numbers. When the team is stomping, it's fun to have in the background, but no one is buying those tickets to the games, right? But also just finally, right, having a close series means that you do get you get more people watching these things, right? They tell you that winning the Ashes is particularly important because of the pride of the ECB, but they never actually met why pride is an interest or explain why specifically the ECB is a particularly prideful organisation outside of the fact that they seem to care a lot about the Ashes, right? I think notably you should weigh that against the success and the monetary incentives of the ECB, which we lay out to you fairly clearly, right? We explain that they care about making profit because it means they can do things like pay people, it enables them to provide and engage in more cricket. If they do care about pride, having more money enables them to make cricket a more prestigious and important sport within the British British culture. But also outside of it just enables them to engage in more high performance players, right? At the end of this, we do not believe there's a trade-off in England's advantage at the end of this debate. We've proved very clearly why that is the case. We've still explained why you still sufficiently get enough challenges and enough benefits to England that when we can compare that with the idea of the when we weigh that with the idea of the development of English players within these leagues, that was enough to get us up in this debate. So let's then talk specifically about why we get English players improved in these leagues to a sufficient degree that makes it important in this debate, right? They tell you a number of things prevent this. First, they tell you that you lose spots. There's that marginal harm. You lose maybe 2 people per team. Notably, the people that you lose in these teams are the least important. They're the bottom 2 players. They were the least likely to be successful, the least likely to be engaged. They were the people who were going to be bumped from the team, right? They then tell you that you lose important roles. They tell you that Australian players, we tell you actually, Australian players are likely to play around the squad. They like to play a bunch of different positions so they can understand the different points of the game, understand different attitudes, and the way the ball works at different points in time. But also notably, right, we think that this is also a harm that is mitigated by their own analysis that says that Australian players only play 5 to 6 games, right? At that point, you're not really locking these English people out. When they bring this analysis about things like, this only occurs once every 4 years, it's a handful of Australian players, know that sort of analysis just harms both sides of this debate equally, right? They never explain why that specifically harms us over them. Then they explain to you, then they tell you that actually, these players are particularly unhelpful and are unlikely to give useful instruction to these teams. Notably, this is not how high performance sports development works, especially in cricket. Because for 90% of the game of cricket, you are standing around chatting with the other people. For most of the training, you're practicing in the nets, talking to other people about their sport and about how their technique can change. Notably, the Australian players have some of the best knowledge in the world, specifically the players that go and play in these teams are the ones that do want to engage with that knowledge and pursue the best. That means they're able to just transfer knowledge over in discussions with teams, in discussions with nets, discussions while they're waiting to go and bat. They're able to talk about techniques and talk about the way they play the game, and that's something just occurs naturally, but also because they can have long days, they want to chat with their friends. They probably just want to make friends. They don't want to be like an ice cold, like stone cold, like dude sitting in the corner of the change room. But also they also like want their team to win, so they're likely to contribute significant and important knowledge. That was particularly important, right? Beyond that, we think that Australian players were likely just to be like quite good and useful because they had outside knowledge, much the same way as like when a high school gets like old boys and old girls to coach their debating team. They can only coach to like a certain level. Similarly, English players, when they coach to a certain level, it was the incredibly high level performance of Australian athletes that was then dispersed across the league that was so important here. They tell you to lose the pressure of like certain game scenarios and like, oh, but like if Steve Smith bats a bunch, you like lose the ability to bat from behind, sure, but there's a bowler who's trying to bowl Steve Smith out who's also in like a similarly stressful position, right? Outside of that, there are a series of other things you can challenge yourself in the game. Personal goals that people probably have, personal expectations that they would still like to hit. Those can probably still do pressures and drive those things. I think the way you need to weigh this point, speaker, is that this is a benefit that's spread across the entire English leagues. They say this doesn't matter because they're like only 4 tenths competitive. Sure, so what? But it's a benefit that accrues to the most competitive players in these leagues who are able to get pulled up. Maybe that means they shuffle into the 4 competitive teams. Maybe that means they are now slightly more competitive for the national squad. That meant on net, the English cricket team was more competitive, and that meant that it was a better, high-quality league that people were more interested in watching. It also meant they were more likely to do things like win the Ashes, or more likely to compete and have aggressive games in the Ashes, or just more likely to drive people to engage in that game, right? Notably, right, any harms they point to of Australians being, even if you believe some of their harms, or like, you know, they have limited efficacy, right? They still have a small degree, there's a very minor portion of Australians in these games, and we explained that a discussion in the change rooms engages all of the team, and locking one person out of the colour spot only locks out that one player from development, right? And the impact here manifests to the largest number of people, because only about 2 people are getting dropped per team. So the end of that, I think it's pretty clear that this massively improved county cricket in England, or at least improved to some degree, that meant that actually outweighed any harms that the other team pointed to. And that meant that when you believe that county cricket got better, you were likely to have a more successful Ashes campaign, especially when you believe the fact that we clearly shut down their claims about this massive advantage that was somehow lost under their side. Then specifically why money matters to county cricket, right? They tell you there are a series of issues that prevent these things from engaging. I think the key thing to note here is the trade-off here is not between county cricket and the IPL. Note the fact that England is a completely different time zone to the IPL. People just don't watch like games in different continents. Look at the way that NBL, NBA, even in Australia has a significantly smaller watch portion than other sports. And just like I'm gonna like gauge, like actually people just like don't engage with like lots of international sport very often. But also county cricket just like on at the time they want to go, they can go and see it in person. They say that this doesn't drive ticket sales to county cricket games because of that local pride. Yeah, that's what actually does drive local sales, because now you can back Steve Smith with your local pride. That meant it was particularly like for people to go to these games and engage them to get more audiences there, and that was really, really important. They told you that, like, yeah, cool. Yeah. At the end of that, I think it's pretty clear that ECB cares deeply about making money, and that means that they can do a lot of other things and improve their squads. We explained very clearly that we did get that increase in money, but we also shut down their push about the Ashes being the most important, and explained that even if you did believe that it was the most important, we were able to fulfill that sufficiently on our side of the debate, and clearly that's why we're going to take this.
This affirmative team wants to claim that Australian players growing once every 4 years is not going to improve county cricket, and in fact is going to take away lots of opportunities and make it far, far worse. Yet simultaneously want to claim that this once in 4 years chance of going to county cricket is going to devastate England's chances of winning the Ashes altogether. This suggests then that even if you believe their characterization at their best, the trade-off in this debate is a slightly higher chance of winning the Ashes versus giving county cricket slightly more development opportunities. The point of those opportunities would allow these players to transition into national team in the future, to increase the chance of the success of that national team in the future. The only team you can give the win to in this debate is side negative. 2 questions then in this reply. Firstly, are Australia meaningfully more likely to win the Ashes if they play county cricket, to the extent the ECB would care? And secondly, does it improve the quality of county cricket? Firstly, on whether it's meaningfully more likely to win the Ashes. There are broadly 3 claims the opposition team make under this. First thing to suggest is it gives valuable experience you couldn't get otherwise. We give you 4 responses throughout our case that soundly defeat this. First thing we explain is that there are actually just not much time you're spending playing county cricket. You probably at most get 4 or 5 matches, as has happened today, before the Ashes starts, which is not necessarily a chance to actually utilise all of that experience to overcome all of those barriers that already exist. The second thing we explain, and that they concede on, is that the quality is often just not very comparable. Many county teams are in fact quite weak in substantial steps below the English side, so it's unclear why practice against those weaker teams directly correlates to greater success against a much stronger team, well obviously that experience often cannot be particularly useful. Thirdly, we explain there are other ways of getting this experience. such a third negative when we tell you that, for example, you can just do intra-squad bans in the country, like happened pre the 2019 Ashes, and that means there is zero benefit to English players at all, because you're not playing with those players, you just play among themselves and still get that knowledge and experience of conditions. Fourthly, they never explain why this alone is sufficient to success, given that players like Steve said have shown in the past they can succeed greatly without the experience in county cricket, and that other players have engaged in county cricket and succeeded in county cricket, but not succeeded in the Ashes where it particularly counted. Notably, we also explain this benefit applies inversely as well, which is so that English players get far more knowledge and understanding and get to see Australian players play in conditions they otherwise wouldn't, which allows them to generate the type of plans that mean they're often far more effective into the future, which why, for example, was why Marnus struggled a lot more when English players came out to Australia because they'd seen more of him in England than they had of other players. The second claim here is that you get knowledge of things like conditions. I would just suggest the point everyone in this debate is very able to describe the conditions of England, suggest something that is well known and you can just train for in other ways. Final thing to say is that players will reveal preference as they give up to play the IPL. Notably, players who play Test cricket are usually not players who are playing the IPL, the ones that are playing in the IPL. This is an uncomparative argument. This means then, at best for this team, there is an incredibly small probabilistic increase that's far from guaranteed that England will lose the Ashes, but it's unclear the England Cricket Board cares that much, given that one, you can obviously compensate this by just making your team better, but secondly, that a more competitive Ashes series actually is good for the English national team. At the point it means it makes you work harder, it makes you improve as a team against strong competition, and maximises your chance of winning things like the World Test Championship, which they don't engage with, but we explain the ECB also cares about, particularly given it is so prideful. Which suggests then that if you care about short-term competitiveness, you actually must vote for side negative because we benefit from those goals. Second question then is on county quality, and notably we suggest, for example, that the reason why county cricket is played with challenges and is often inconsistent in quality is the reason why the national team has often spent periods of time where they've struggled internationally. By maximising the quality of those players, we enable future success and future Ashes victories, which is obviously extraordinarily important. They have three claims here. Firstly, that these players won't really help each other. We explain why. It's very rarely that actual players within your county are your Ashes, like people you're competing against there. Secondly, you want long-term contracts post-career, because these can be quite lucrative, which is why you want to be nice. Thirdly, you just have heaps of opportunities to chat. Finally, you get better future competition, which the players care about. Secondly, they say you lose out on opportunities. One, this also gives new opportunities. It means English batters now going to play against Michael Nessa or English bowlers Steve Smith. That seems good. Secondly, you maximise these opportunities for people who will be future players in the national team, which seems good. Finally, this occurs primarily in weaker clubs, so you get the largest comparative benefit. Fourthly, if they say, oh, this isn't needed for the success of the English system more broadly, I would point to the fact that many players have moved up into that system and deeply struggled in national cricket, suggest that county opposition being so widely different is why more international players are good. We also explain Australian players are uniquely beneficial to this because they're just the best players in the world that's particularly good. Which means, if you believe the ECB is prideful, if you believe they care about success, you must believe they also care about their future success and image, which is why Australian players are so important, it's why negative wins this debate.
This team loses the debate by losing the urn of England. So let's start by talking about winning. The opposition's only substantial push on this issue is the concept of a future Ashes, but we explain that's not enough for four reasons. Firstly, we point out Australians, right from first, are a minority of the players there, and they rarely play for extended periods of time. We point out at second that these players have no incentive to help, they are direct competitors to England and don't want to help them. At third, we point out this is a tension with their case, where they point out that counter conditions are different. And finally, we explain a countervailing harm. We point out that these Australian players often crowd out very particular positions, they crowd out very particular game states, and that's the particular harm. Notably though, their accusations of symmetry only concede that this entire point is moot. They say, well, the harm is very minimal because symmetrically, the Australians are only there for a little amount of time. Sure, if they want to take that line, fine. Our response falls, but so does their entire case. Let's move on to the real debate. We explain, by dramatic contrast, a concrete and simple thing, which is that Australians are often unfamiliar with swing, with the conditions, with the rhythm of the game in England, and we provide them the knowledge to succeed. The opposition's responses down the bench were late and entirely insufficient. They firstly say, well, Australia will play tour games, something that the average person probably knows hasn't happened on Australia's last two tours famously. They say, well, day 5 is the best seller, which is factually a Monday. And they say, well, let's just let them figure us out so that we can figure out our response to them, rather than surprise them with our tactics, claim a benefit, and then allow this gameplay to continue. If I was a judge, I would think these arguments don't even merit a response, Which is why I, a humble reply speaker, have just had to supply facts the average reasonable person would not to entirely knock them out of the debate. But even beside all the hullabaloo about symmetry and marginal benefits, directly weigh the concept of this future ashes against the material we provide. On exclusivity, they provide no reason why there are not other developmental programs. On the degree of marginal change, a slight step down for the county is clearly smaller than a substantial set of experience for Australians. And on the sum of the whole, we point out, at best, a few Australians join a pool of thousands of county players, whereas those Australians make up like half of the Ashes team and they all benefit. On the issue of the Ashes, we claim a decisive victory, as I hope Australia will over the next month or so, and on that issue alone, we win the debate. The last gasp of this team is to talk about money generation from county cricket, but we explain firstly, this is not the best way to do it. There are things like the 100, there's limited overs, where England has found a lot of success. We also explain this isn't a particularly good way to do it, because it competes with the IPL, it's poorly broadcast outside of England, and there's no national pride element. We also explain it's not a worthwhile way to make money, because these foreign players cost money and are often glamour purchases, and the Australians will eventually play later anyway, where your ticket sales and your broadcasting rights are more valuable. And finally, we explain it's not even a noticeable way to generate more money, because most of the viewership is derived from local pride. The Australians are so few, and so few kind of among them, and they're so short, there for such a short period of time, while other international stars are there as well. Weigh this flimsy attempt to turn a traditional, anachronistic scheme devised in England into a moneymaker against our concrete plan to win the urn. The result of this debate is clear.
Thank you very much for that speech. Anyone would like to cross the floor, shake hands, head outside. We'll have a result for you in about 10-15 minutes. Hi everyone, thank you all for the debate. Obviously, massive cricket fan, really enjoyed this debate, and I think teams did a very good job on a sports motion. I think at times the debate was pretty good at making the sport stuff accessible to non-sport fans. Obviously, I'm not the best judge of that because I am a sports fan. So, but I think otherwise it was pretty good. I'll give some general feedback, announce the result, and go through the reasons for the result. For bits of general feedback, I think the biggest thing in this debate is that obviously there is not a tension, but the scale of the amount of players going over here and how long they play for, being it big or small, really does massively change win conditions for both teams. So I think what really helped teams today was when they were able to explain why something being smaller actually made a bigger harm or vice versa. So when you have a debate where the responses you want to give to try and mitigate harms also mitigate benefits, trying to be really clear on separating why those two things act differently or benefit your side specifically. The second thing I think is at times rebuttal just missed the point in today's debate. We had a lot of chat about the IPL that I don't think quite connected to what teams were actually saying on it, for example. And the last thing I think in general feedback is there are a lot of examples in the debate that made sense to me today, but might not make sense to other judges. Like, it's not inconceivable that Surrey will set a cricket motion at Australs, and you'll have a judge who's never seen a cricket game in their life. So like when you say Cameron Bancroft, or when you say Sussex or Middlesex, who the fuck, what are they, So I think actually taking a step to explain what those things are so your average regional punter can understand what you're talking about. In terms of the result then, we had the same call. We both gave it the side affirmative. Congratulations. It was quite a close and competitive debate though. So I think there are two broad clashes in today's debate. One about the value the Aussies provide with a couple of sub-points, and then secondly on winning the Ashes itself. There's a third issue I'll start with is just what is the interests of this actor. I don't think this is broadly particularly important in the debate because teams have largely agreed the idea of pride and winning versus making money. But I think ultimately both sides show how either approach of theirs of winning or trying to generate revenue by having stars all sort of ends up with the money aspect at the end, and pride comes as part of winning. So they're all kind of linked to like what do we do to actually make money and win games. I think there's a huge amount of disagreement there between teams that is consequential to the result. In terms of the first question then, what is the value Australians provide to the English county cricket? I think the first sort of, setup question for this is just a characterisation issue of how many people go, how long do they go for, who goes, that sort of thing. I think at this point, AF probably provides enough reasoning in the debate to suggest it's likely to be a small group of people, both in terms of the rules that exist around how many players you can have per team, the competing commitments around IPL, the money you get paid, the time away from the God's country, and things like that. So at this point, I think it is probably a smaller group of people. In terms of who goes, I think it is reasonable that both sides make reasonable claims about who is likely to go. Both the big dogs wanting to go to get better at the Ashes and some smaller fringe players likely to go. But ultimately, I don't think either team proves it is likely to be overwhelmingly their one or exclusively their one in the debate. So I think it's likely to be a mix of both the Bancrofts and the Steve Smiths going to play, just sort of like the factual claims that both teams make on who has actually gone in recent years. So given that context, then the most important thing to come out of that, I think, is it is likely to be a few and not a huge amount of players. So the second sub-point of this clash, then, it becomes about this issue of money and viewership. Does having more Aussies in your county cricket league increase the viewership of that county cricket league, which is the big push we get from side negative, that you have people wanting to turn out and watch Steve Smith or watch Labuschagne play, and that increases the league overall. I think the first thing, I think App has a number of responses to this to make that benefit a lot smaller. The first is to point out that there is existing a limited viewer set that is over likely to want to watch county cricket, and the additional viewers that these people would bring in are most likely to come from overseas, and they're the ones that just won't watch because it's hard to watch international cricket. Secondly, there's broadcast deal issues, which mean that the stuff is just broadcast behind a paywall, so no one can actually access it. So the capacity to increase that viewership is limited to just those who already attend in person. That is likely to be that already rusted on set. Thirdly, they talk about the competition, that there's also other stuff going on at the time that people are more likely to watch. Fourthly, because there was stuff already said about who is likely to just being the other diehards. But I think the other big things that AF is able to do is, one, point out that there are stronger revenue sources for the ECB than this as the way to make money, looking at things like the 100 and limited overs cricket and the Ashes overall being the bigger money drivers, which actually means that even if you do get a marginal increase here, it is smaller, but also that even if you do get a marginal increase, there is... I'm saying the same thing twice, but the Ashes and the 100 and that sort of stuff provide a bigger financial increase than what this does. So I think at the end of this point, maybe there's a marginal increase in some more people going to go watch Steve Smith play, but it is time limited by the amount of time they play for. It is person limited by how many people go over, and there's other ways to make that money, which means it probably isn't the most important thing in the debate. The third element of this argument then becomes around developing English talent, which I think is where the stronger push comes from side negative today. So the fact that you provide the best Aussies go over there, they provide a lot of benefit when they play with these players, they build up their skills, team environments, etc. I think the first note to make there is that is slightly in tension with the other characterization that Neg runs. It's just the sideline players that go. It's the Nessers, Bancrofts, it's the people who are on the tangents. Now, obviously, stepping out of the debate, I know that even our shit tier C level players are about 1,000,000 times better than your best English team. But that is not in the debate. That is just a personal observation about cricket skills. So I think more needs to be that. I think that tension, and also the potential could be brought out a bit by Affirmative, but I think it does limit the benefit a little bit there. I think the second thing I want to talk about in this part is about the idea that the whole team, what are the incentives of these people? Do they go with incentive to help their team, or they don't want to help the enemy when they're over there? I think Neg does make some pretty reasonable claims at third in particular. You're there with your mates, you want to hang out and play cricket. There's lots of time just talking about the tactics, and all that does build up and does help people. So I don't necessarily think the incentive stuff fully wins the issue for Affirmative, because there probably are some reasons why they still want to do good and win. But it is the other issues around the scale of that benefit that mean that as in ultimately the win for negative. So why does Neg not win this issue? I think AF responses are, firstly, it minimises the scope of who is likely to go. So there's a very limited number of a couple of players every year, which means the capacity to benefit the whole county cricket league is quite limited. Secondly, then, is looking at who exactly goes, and this is where I think it starts to blend into the next issue in the debate more, but is the risk of the big players going. So it is actually not a good thing that these players come, which then the third thing about the role they play being significant and important roles in the team, which dislodges other people, and the likely amount of time they go for is quite short. So the capacity to have that benefit of really improving English county cricket when they're there for a couple of games every 4 years probably starts to really minimise how much this does improve English talent or English cricket overall. I think Neg has a couple of things that maybe make these harms a bit smaller. That being that they're looking for contracts when they retire, so they're likely to have that benefit in the long term when they finish cricket, when they finish their international careers and want to go back. But how many players is that likely to be? How big an impact that's likely to have when they're old and broken and retired and things like that? There's also some questions about whether or not these Aussie players would play in different roles to the key roles, so therefore to change up their skills, etc. I'm unclear a bit why that is likely, given the role of cricket as your position you play is really important to how you play, and even the risk of that is small. I think that the risk is large that they're playing in their position. I think maybe the best thing from Neg that probably doesn't get enough airtime is just that so the best response, I think, is the idea that it doesn't take that many spots away from other good English players because there are so many teams spread out. So maybe Africa done a bit more as to why this is likely to be the compromise of like, Mitch Stark takes away Jimmy Anderson's spot or something like that. But I think it does overall hurt the talent pool of developing more talent, even if for that short period of time, somewhat. And this is where I think that issue I said in general feedback about the mitigation and the harms benefits becomes really clear, because a lot of the stuff that NEG does to try and minimise the harms that it has to English cricket actually do start to minimise the benefits a lot at this point. So at the end, I'm likely to believe there's maybe a tiny benefit to English cricket of this, but I don't think that also minimises the harms it potentially has to winning the Ashes overall, but also I think AS able to minimise just how big that benefit is to English talent. Which then leads into the third issue of who's going to win the Ashes and what is more likely. Obviously, again, outside the debate, Australia's going to win this 5-0, but I think this is just a question of risk calculation. So I think what maybe at best NEG is able to make this a little bit smaller, but I think still presents a strong picture overall of why this is not a risk worth taking, given there is very small benefit to trade off against that risk. So the first part of this, I think, was the question of who is more dominant. I thought this would have gotten a bit more airtime in the debate, given the historical fact that Australia hasn't won in England since 2001. I think, obviously, stepping into feedback for a second, there's probably a lot more this debate could have said about why drawn series and how that impacts as opposed to like just needs to be an outright whitewash. But in any case, I think what this means is England probably has some degree of dominance, but AS response to like needing to win by a lot and needing to lock that dominance in for the long term probably suggests enough to me that this is still an important thing that we want to do well in going forward. Where I think they actually have some quite clever stuff here is to say, well, actually the Ashes isn't the most important thing. ECB also cares about the World Test Championships and also cares about wanting to just be more dominant overall. I think the problem here, I think this isn't enough to outweigh for a couple of reasons. I think the first is the AF does explain why the Ashes in particular is so key, because it is the historical rivalry, it is the biggest thing between Australia and England, and it does have a lot of cultural connotation with it that maybe everything else doesn't quite have. But also, and that then leads to making more money off the Ashes, but also it's unclear that the preparation for the World Test Championship, etc., is massively harmed by having a focus on the Ashes or trying to prepare for it. And any sort of gains that the NEG wanted to talk about for cricket overall were reliant on the first things I discussed about the value of money and the value of extra players. So given that they don't win those issues, it's unclear that it harms it here. What then I think AF's able to do, and this is where they push ahead and take the win, is this idea of how Aussies provide, like Aussies going over there, get that additional extra bit of experience that does maybe make the difference in how well they play or how likely they are to win. There are a series of them responses we get, and I think, the reason for that, I think, is quite well explained in the nuances of the swing, the wobble, the way the pitches play, and how different England is to everywhere else. It's some quite good analysis on where these pitches don't connect to any other pitches in the world, which make it particularly important you get condition-relevant experience in England. I think NEG then has a series of responses that maybe at best mitigate this, but I don't think ultimately defeat the benefit that does exist to players going. The first is the clashing examples of Steve Smith and Cam Bancroft, that Steve Smith didn't go last time and dominated, Cam Bancroft did go and sucked. I mean, maybe. I think those are probably true examples, but I don't think why that was likely to be the most common outcome for all these players, I think was the issue missing there. But also, even if it is likely that some players don't do very well, there's a risk that some players will do very well that AF explains it does compromise the biggest thing we care about being the Ashes. The second thing NEG does is try and minimise it. So the idea that it is only a small group of players going, so the benefit isn't that big. I think both of us on the panel thought that AF's explanation here of why just a couple of key players going and getting that experience is really, really important. So even if it is a minimised benefit, because the whole squad or the whole Australia doesn't get the benefits, it's the key players that do, and that is the harm there. The third one I thought was clever was that the English now get to see the Aussie bowlers too. So, they get to sort of see the Aussie players too, so they get to bowl against them or bat against them, and that's really important for the experience. I think more responses could have been done here from AF as to why that wasn't as a harmful thing. I think ultimately, though, given that the exposure to the conditions is what's particularly important, even if the English do get to see you, they see you on Aussie tours, etc., but the exposure you get uniquely to conditions that the English people already have the condition over is particularly important, and that's particularly important comparative advantage because we don't let them come here and experience Australian conditions. And the last thing I think NEG says is the overall conditions, so the overall quality of county cricket is worse, so therefore they don't actually get a massive benefit as players. But again, I think it falls back to the conditions aspect, so even if they're playing its worst position, they're still seeing what the ball does on those pitches overall. So at the end of that, there is a clear risk of letting these Aussie players go that has big consequences for their capacity to win the Ashes, to be competitive, to make money, etc., versus a very small speculative benefit to the increasing income or the increase in overall English talent in that time. So that's why AF is able to win that trade-off and win the debate. Hope that all made sense. If you have any questions, please come for feedback and talk to both of us. But otherwise, well done on the debate. Best of luck for the rest of the and for Australs.